Brilliant. I believe I am live on everything. Let's see if this actually works. And finally, I need to record. Nice. Hello, Nita. Hello. I'm just booting up my recording software. So all of this should hopefully work. And okay, I believe that's live. So now I just need to go 3, 2, 1. And that makes my producers happy. And it's only 2 minutes past. Oh, if everything's working, that'd be so good. But it might not be. So we're about to find out. And no one's viewing there, that's fine. Hasn't even really kicked off yet. And I'm going to share my screen real quick. I'm not hearing anything from anyone else, but if that's the case.
Hello, Lucas.
Oh no, I can hear someone. Okay. Hello. Right. Apparently my internet connection is unstable, which is slightly concerning. Why is that happening? Sorry, I'm just turning off a video. It's fine. That's the idea. And for some reason, I can't spotlight my own video, even though I'd very much like to. Something's going slightly wonky here, but I think it's fine. Let's see what happens here.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hello.
Hello, Lucas.
And welcome.
Welcome.
I think my internet connection is saying it's unstable. I'm running a lot of different things on at once, so I'm slightly worried about that. I think it should be fine. Let's see.
Maybe, do you need everything? Could you shut down some of the other stuff?
No, that's not, I'm afraid, how it works. Let's just see what happens. And as long as everyone can hear me vaguely loudly and vaguely clearly, that's what's really important anyway. So
I can hear you.
wonderful. Excellent. I'm not, high bitrate video doesn't matter. So we're going to be starting in just about 5 minutes. We'll see if anyone else turns up, including Zoe or Dad. And there other people as well. Just gonna do that. And yeah, this should be a good one, I think. I think it's interesting stuff that's being discussed. I've got some social history points to make, and there's politicsy stuff happening, and it's a whole thing. And I'm just wondering if there's no one else is trying to join or anything. No. Let's see. Yeah, we're now in the 17th century. So we've moved on 50, 60 years from the last talk. But there are still the ramifications of what's been happening previously is still happening now. So that should be interesting.
Sorry, how many years ahead are we from where we
are 50 or 60 years ahead of where we were before.
Okay, brilliant.
And in fact, I'm just trying to work out if something's gone slightly wrong, possibly. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for a second. Okay. And then I'm going to put on speaker view and then spotlight my own video. That's what I wanted to do. Right. Let's do this. Same steps in the same order that I normally do this all in, and then it's fine. Welcome, people are joining in now, which is good. And then I need to re-share my screen to that. Oh gosh, people are flooding in. How exciting. Ah, yes, yeah, it's all working. Welcome, welcome. And I'm just going to check to make sure that so in a couple of minutes we're going to kick off, and I now have some participants, which is nice, and possibly even some people watching on YouTube as well, which would be good. And that will help me see if that system is working or not. Apparently there are 3 people watching on YouTube. That's exciting. Shout out to my YouTube viewers. You can find me at Mostly Harmless History, just like the graphic says, done by my wonderfully talented friend, Kristen, has done the thing that you're seeing now before you.
I think it really does capture you. I don't know if Kristen's on this, but she's done a really good job, yes.
Well, she might see the recording. I'm not sure she's watching right now, but she should be proud of herself, yeah. And in 1 minute, we're going to kick off. And as a bit of preamble, I think it's quite interesting, this conflict that took place over 30 years. There's a lot of interesting stuff to talk about with it. One of which is that there are many ways of describing this conflict in terms that sound quite familiar. If I would say that there was a war that began with an act of political terrorism that then drew in all the great powers and caused this general European conflict that millions of people died during the course of, then you might think of the First World War. If I said there was a conflict in which had been a treaty that tried to stop any more violence, that just set up the battle lines for what was going to happen next, you might be reminded of the Second World War. And if I said that there was a conflict in which there was a civil war going on in one country and a foreign power sponsored battle to weaken the people they're trying to fight, you might think of Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam, the proxy wars of the Cold War. And yet all of these things apply to the 30 Years' War, which we're going to talk about right now. So without further ado, welcome everyone who managed to work out the intricacies and craziness of Zoom and YouTube and whatever other difficulties we're experiencing. But luckily, we're all here. Welcome all. Well done for making it so far. And thank you all for continuing to be such an amazing audience. And let's kick off and ask the question we're going to seek to answer is why was the 30 Years' War? Why did it happen? What caused this crisis really to happen? And today we're going to talk about why is it that we talk about wars so much when we talk about history? Because I know it's a thing that's not very interesting to a lot of people. It's not even very interesting to me. I find descriptions of battles endlessly boring. Then we're going to talk about it anyway and have a discussion on how it happened, what happened afterwards, and then really have a think about the implications of this conflict. And I wonder if YouTube will tell me off for having some slight nudity in a portrait painting here, but we'll see if I can get away with it. And there's one where I've actually censored it because it's actual fine arts, but there's nudity in fine arts. But first off, let's talk about why we talk about conflict. And there is a book by Donald Kagan, who is a historian, called On the Origins of War and the Preservation of Peace. And he argues that really a lot of the way that we are taught about war and conflict is wrong. Because if you go back and look at the last 2,000 years of European history, you would be hard-pressed to find a year here and there where there wasn't some kind of war. And he says that's because when nations pursuing their own interests come into conflict with each other, the natural result of that is war, which is unfortunate. And it's this crisis that keeps happening. In the same way, we now think of disease as this one-off thing, that's this massive crisis that we just couldn't quite stop, which you might be thinking about right now. And people castigate politicians for saying, why couldn't you stop this disease from killing people? But 100 years ago, and all the time before then, this disease was just a thing that happened that swept through and killed millions of people. And it was this constant, unending, naturalistic phenomenon. In the same way now, when there is a war, we view it as this crisis that should have been averted. But Donald Kagan argues that really, when there's a peace, you have to ask, why was there a peace? Rather than asking, when there's a war, why was there a war? And we're going to do that. But it's not just a thing that's continued to happen for centuries. That's not reason enough alone to talk about wars all the time. Because, well, that doesn't make them interesting. It doesn't make them good. But what conflict really is a really good proxy, a really good case study for understanding the different trends and forces in play at the time the conflict happens. That's really why I think that studying and analyzing wars are interesting. Also, they're often a good story, but really, when we look at the trends and forces in conflict that led to this war and were in place throughout it, in a very Hegelian dialectic, I'm not going to describe that anymore. That's the only words you're going to get from that side of things. But when you understand these conflicts, you can really understand the society and the people living in these societies that caused the war and that let it happen for so long in the first place. And finally, I do think that we can still maintain our focus. And our focus here is, the goal of this lecture series is really to say the history of people, the history of humanity is the history of people. So let's look at people, right? That's what I've tried to do at every stage. And I think you very much can do that. And you can keep the focus rather than, oh, this king declared war on this nation. And then we're going to look at the actual lives of people and how things happened on the ground level. And I think we can keep our focus even when talking about conflicts. So let's talk about then this conflict. And there were a few things that we need to understand beforehand. There are tensions throughout Europe, and there are a variety of different tensions. You may remember from 2 weeks ago, we talked about the Protestant Reformation. Well, there are religious tensions still in place. The Protestant Reformation was at least a stable dynamic equilibrium balance point was reached in 1555 with the Peace of Augsburg, where it was decided that in Latin, this Peace of Augsburg can be summed up in 4 words, which I'll translate for you. Cuius regio eius religio, which means to each ruler, their religion. basically whoever's in charge, they can pick Protestant or Catholic. And in fact, Protestantism was recognized as an official religion that you're allowed to have in the Holy Roman Empire, which we've discussed in previous lectures, was this large political entity that was very decentralized. So in short, up until 1618, which is when this conflict is going to start, we're in the early 17th century here, it's generally agreed that if you want to, you can be Protestant, and if you don't want to, you can be Catholic. But and also within the Peace of Augsburg, it was agreed that if you are a Catholic person living in a Protestant nation, or vice versa, you can privately keep your own beliefs and even sometimes publicly profess those beliefs. There's an amount of freedom of conscience and freedom of religion, kind of. And if that sounds too good to be true, it's because it kind of is. It wasn't exactly agreed to or enforced all the time that it possibly could have been. But that was a religious tension. In theory, we have peace, the Peace of Augsburg. You can be Protestant or Catholic. In practice, there's tension. Secondly, there are federal, from the modern perspective, we would call federal tensions within the Holy Roman Empire, in which you can be... There are two sides of it. The Holy Roman Empire is this very large, very decentralized political entity that's possibly an empire. We talked about that a little bit before. And how much power should the emperor have is the basic question. Should the individual, if you're the Duke of Saxony, or you're Moritz of Nassau, should you have more autonomy or less autonomy? Well, if you are a powerful prince in the Holy Roman Empire, you might say, I want more autonomy. If you're the Holy Roman Emperor, you might say, I want them to have less autonomy, and I think we should centralize the empire more. That's the tension. And finally, we have geopolitical tensions. And you may have been wondering who this slightly unfortunate looking person is. And this is a classic example. I believe this is one of the Maximilians. This is the Habsburg jaw you're looking at. And there are two major powers in Europe in this time, in the early 17th century. And they are the House of Habsburg and the House of Bourbon. And the Habsburgs tend to be ruling over the Holy Roman Empire, and also Italy and Spain, parts of the Netherlands, parts of the New World, vast. Whereas the Bourbons, who are famous for their biscuits and their whiskey, they are ruling over France, effectively. But France is a very dynamic, very wealthy, and very powerful state in this period. And those two are in conflict and often come to blows. And the 30 Years' War is in some ways a fight along those lines, as well as the other two. And those are the trends, but the trigger takes place in Bohemia, which is modern-day Czechia, and before modern day, the Czech Republic, and other names as well, in which there's complex imperial politics, but effectively, Bohemia is quite Protestant, very Protestant, some would say. And Emperor Matthias wants the Catholic Ferdinand II to rule Bohemia and then eventually rule everywhere once he dies. And the Ferdinand II is quite a Catholic person. He is quoted as having said, I would rather see my lands destroyed than tolerate heresy for a single day. So he's not a fan of the Protestants, I think it's fair to say. And so he argues that, well, he claims, oh no, it's fine. When I rule Bohemia, I'll let you all be Protestants. But the Protestants in Bohemia, they're panicking and they're thinking, oh no. If this guy comes in, he's gonna massacre us all. There's a territory that Ferdinand had previously ruled that had been Protestant, and he had turned it Catholic by force. And so the Protestants are panicking. And when Ferdinand sends two Catholic councillors to rule in his place until he can get there and rule it personally, something happens. And there is a tradition in Prague that when there are rulers that you don't like, you defenestrate them, which is a word that means throw them out of the window. And this picture we have here is Prague Castle. And that second-story window, the one in the middle that you can see in front of you, these two Catholic councillors were thrown out of in what's called the third defenestration of Prague. People were thrown out of windows before it, and people were thrown out of windows after it. This is a number of, I don't know why this is a tradition, maybe we should bring it back, of defenestrations. When you don't like someone politically, you throw them out the window. And in fact, these two Catholic councillors, they survived. Somehow, they fell 70 meters, I think it's estimated, and they lived. And it basically caused a revolt, where the Protestants revolted against the Catholics. And over the course of this war, the international powers were dragged into the conflict by either wanting to stop the imperial powers, to help out fellow Protestants, or simply to limit the power of the Habsburgs. And eventually the Spanish, Dutch, Danes, Swedish, and French, and also most people who are powerful in the Holy Roman Empire, get dragged into this horrifyingly complex war. Which is why I will not say the name of a single battle that takes place in this war, because you can see this graphic to the right of you shows the involvement of different countries in the 30 Years' War. And oh my lord, it's complicated. In dark black, that's a country was directly helping out the emperor. In dark red, a country was directly against the emperor. In grey, a country was indirectly helping the emperor. And in pink, a country was indirectly against the emperor. So you can see various countries fought at various times, sometimes even on different sides, or just, sometimes on different sides, or indirectly helping different sides. And it starts out with the Catholics fighting the Protestants, and then the French get involved, and then it's confusing. But over the course of the 30 Years' War, which was 29 years, 11 months, 3 weeks, and 1 day long, 20% of Germany dies. That's 8 million people. That's almost at the levels of the world wars in terms of deaths, the First World War at least. And it spread all over Europe, mostly in Germany, but the French fought the Spanish over the Pyrenees. There was fighting in the Netherlands, modern-day Netherlands and Belgium. Back then it was all just called the Low Countries. Even all over the world there was fighting. A Dutch fleet conquered Pernambuco, which is in modern-day Brazil from the Portuguese. There was fighting in modern-day Sri Lanka and in Africa. This was almost a proto-world war. Am I bold enough to make that claim? Yes, I am. This was almost a proto-world war in terms of scale and geographical scale. And rather than discussing battles and who was a good general and, oh, this gun was effective, let's try and think about what was it like to live in Europe while this crisis was going on? This is 30 years, almost exactly. That's a generation of people who grew up under this war. And the first thing to stress is that these were almost exclusively foreign armies. In the modern day, when there is an army that's raised, it's conscripts normally, if it's a large army, and the people are out there fighting for their country. In this period, that's not the case. It's the 17th century, and everyone's using mercenary armies. So free companies. It's an army that already exists. It's comprised of Italians or Swiss people or Irish people. Those are 3 very common groups of mercenaries. And you buy that army and say, right, you go fight for me. And then they do. And that means their loyalty isn't to the state. It's not to God, king, and country, as they said in the First World War. It's just to whoever's paying them. And that means that when this army moves through a territory, even if it's a friendly territory, very bad things happen. I'm going to read to you a first-hand account from a man called Friedrich Wilhelm Hoffmann, who describes what it was like when the city of Magdeburg, which had been a very important city in the Holy Roman Empire, was sacked by the imperial forces. And he says, quote, "Then the city was given over to murder, burning, plundering, torture, and beatings. Every enemy soldier demanded booty. When such men entered a house, if the master was able to give them something, he could save and protect himself and his household, until another came along to take whatever he had. Finally, when everything had been given away and there was nothing left to give, the real trouble began. The soldiers began to beat and frighten. They threatened to shoot, skewer, hang, etc., so that anything remained, either buried in the earth or locked up in 1,000 castles, the people would have gotten it and brought it forth. During such rage, this wonderful and great city, like a princess over the entire land, stood completely in flames amidst terrible misery, unspeakable distress, and heartbreak. Accompanied by unspeakable, terrible cries and much hullabaloo, many thousands of innocent men, women, and children were murdered and slaughtered in all sorts of merciless and wretched ways, so that words alone cannot adequately describe these acts, nor tears adequately bemoan them. This most terrible moment lasted not much more than 2 hours in the city, as the wind unexpectedly picked up and furiously spread the fire. While Count von Pappenheim is said to have ordered at first that the citizens and inhabitants be made anxious and fearful, Later, the vile rabble of soldiers showed no discretion and would not stop. By around 10 o'clock in the morning, everything was engulfed in flames. And by 10 o'clock that night, the entire city, along with its beautiful town hall and all its churches, lay in ashes, just a heap of stones. Then, to avoid being burned with the city, the imperial marauders had to flee the city and retreat to their camps. It is estimated that 20,000 people died in the sacking of that city alone. So it was not fun to live in Germany or anywhere in Europe while this war was going on. There were descriptions of people openly saying, is this the apocalypse? Is this the end of the world? Will the powers and countries of the world just tear each other apart? People are saying how it mimics the book of Revelation. So they say, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. Well, that's going on in this period. However, there was one more impact of the war that's possibly unexpected. Yes, there are plagues and famines and massacres, but this is the highest point of witch hunting at any stage in the world, in Europe. In the 17th century, in this period during the war, women are accused of witchcraft and executed in their thousands. There is no accurate record of how many women were executed for their crimes. And it reaches such a fever pitch that it declines in this period too. The rise and fall of witch hunting takes place over the course of the 30 Years' War. A man called Friedrich Spee, who had been I think it was called Catholic confessor, where they take the confessions of women who had been tortured to the point of confessing that they were witches. And he writes this book called Cursio Criminalis, where he castigates the witch hunting phenomenon and says it's all wrong. And no one was actually a witch. And he says, I quote, "If the reader will allow me to say something here, I confess that I myself have accompanied several women to their deaths in various places over the years, and I am now so certain of their innocence that I feel there's no effort that would not be worthy my undertaking to try to reveal this truth." And I think it actually takes quite a lot of moral courage to realize that violence the state has been enacting for years was all to no purpose and had no point and was just violence. There's modern parallels you can draw with people who leak, Chelsea Manning, someone like that, who leaks this kind of horrible acts and reveals what happens and starts its decline. And there are lots of arguments as to why this witch hunting took place so much. And Silvia Federici argues that the reason why these witch hunts happen so much in this period is partly people are desperate and they sought supernatural reasons for why their lives were falling apart, but also modernization of society is taking place. Witch hunts, she argues, curtailed women's rights. Sex work was restricted and criminalized. Midwifery and medicine were taken from women. The wise woman of the village in medieval and early modern society is accused of being a witch and burned. And these jobs of medicine and doctorhood are given to men instead. Women are now tied to the domestic sphere. Witches are accused of sacrificing children or having sex with the devil. Women have, in this case, subverted the natural order, which is then assumed by these accusations, in which they are purely in the domestic sphere. So Silvia Federici says, and I quote, "The outcome of these policies that lasted for 2 centuries was the enslavement of women to procreation, defining women in terms as mothers, wives, daughters, and widows that hid their status as workers." So that's what's going on to the people on the ground for these 30 years. Until eventually, the international powers, after only 22 years, everyone realizes these wars just can't go on and someone eventually has to give. But 8 years after that, the powers of Europe come to agreement in a place called Westphalia. And there was a peace of Westphalia. And the goal here was to create what was then at the time called a universal peace, in which it was argued that there would be no more wars after this. The great powers of Europe will be balanced out, and there would not be a war like this again. That was the goal. Essentially, that meant a Protestant/French victory. So that means that the rulers of imperial states can choose their own religion. Catholics and Protestants are recognized as equal under the law. So is Calvinism. The Dutch Republic is recognized as independent. Switzerland is as well. France gains territory. Sweden gains money and land. You may not be surprised to hear that the Catholics weren't too pleased about this treaty. The Pope Innocent X called it null, void, invalid, iniquitous, unjust, damnable, reprobate, inane, empty of meaning and effect for all time. So he wasn't so much of a fan of it either. But effectively, they decided that there would be peace throughout Europe through this international treaty. And there is this notion of what's called Westphalian sovereignty. And it's the idea that this is the origin of international European treaties. Again, something that's recently relevant in British politics, if anyone's following that. The idea of there being international treaties that everyone holds, and therefore we have peace. And if you break these treaties, you haven't just caused a war and that's bad, but you've lied in effect, you've broken the law, and you should be punished for that as well as for starting this war. And that's the argument made. And this has been challenged by scholars such as historian Andreas Osiander, I think is how you pronounce his name. Apologies to you if I've butchered your name there. But I kind of can see where it's coming from. After this, any particularly large war that takes place between many of the major powers, this would happen after, for example, the 7 Years' War, after the wars that result from the French Revolution and Napoleon, after the First World War, after the Second World War as well. There is a set of treaties that aim to rebalance Europe and make sure there wouldn't be wars anymore. And other international treaties start appearing around this time. Westphalia also argues that it reasserts the everyone can pick what religion they want to be. And that kind of stays the case from now on. People can choose the religion. There are religious wars afterwards, but they're small scale, never like the size of the 30 Years' War. Never like that large again. And so let's actually think about what happened afterwards, because it did change the geopolitics of Europe. The Habsburgs moved into decline, and the French become just predominant, all-powerful. Also, it's the beginning of the end of the Holy Roman Empire. It will take 2 centuries to happen. But by the time the Holy Roman Empire ceases to exist, it will be almost in name only. There will be an emperor, but he will have almost no authority over the peoples living in Germany. After the Treaty of Westphalia and the 30 Years' War, you can see the rise in the beginning of German nationalism. There's a notion that there are a German people independent of Habsburg domination, that the people themselves might have some kind of sovereignty. And last of all, let's ask the question, was there universal peace after the Treaty of Westphalia? Well, no, obviously not. As I said, you can tell in that little hint that there were world wars and there were massive general European wars that took place after this. So in that sense, yes, it failed to have universal peace and Westphalian sovereignty didn't really happen-ish, but at least it was a goal to make peace forever after. That had never been the case before in these general European treaties. You'll see it again in the Treaty of Vienna in 1848. So we're 100 years, almost exactly afterwards. I hadn't noticed that before. So what can we conclude here? And let's talk about what we've talked about today. First off, the causes of the conflict. There's various tensions, forces in tension that were taking place in Europe up until this point, of religious conflicts, Protestant and Catholic people wanting them to rule themselves and to avoid being forced into a different religion. Also, Habsburgs and those trying to limit their power, and the rising Bourbons and the resurgent French power. And also the institution of how important should the Holy Roman Empire be, or should these rulers rule themselves? Secondly, we've looked at the lived experience and what it was like to live in Europe in this time. Not very good. Things are getting worse. In fact, it's possible to argue. And what you have here is a graph of population reduction, where the light color is around a third of people dying, and the dark color is around 2/3 of people dying. So it's very, very bad. People are dying in massive amounts in this case. So finally, let's try and answer the question, was it a war of religion? Well, that kind of depends on who you ask. For the people of what was called the Protestant Union and the people living in Bohemia, so this is the Swedish, Danish, Brandenburgian peoples, they seem to be saying, yes, we're fighting to defend Protestantism. However, if you ask some other people, they were fighting to maintain the integrity of the Holy Roman Emperor. And in fact, Brandenburg switched from one to the other. But if you argue the French, they were pouring money in to keep the Protestant powers in the fight very much indirect proxy war style. They were Catholic. They were obviously anti-Protestantism, but it was so much more important to them that they keep the Habsburgs down, that they were willing to fight against that religious sense. So there's generally kind of a view that it started out as religious and then became political. But historian Peter Wilson from the University of Hull, he's argued that it was never really religious. It was only ever realpolitik. But then if you ask not just the people in charge, but why was it fought from the people who are actually fighting? Well, they were fighting for money. They were fighting to survive. Often if your town was sacked and burnt by a mercenary company, you would join another mercenary company to have some kind of income. Because the only money going into the state right now, there's no one's building roads. They're only raising and supplying armies. So that's why you would fight. You would fight to survive when these great powers destroy each other. And so to answer the question, why was it fought? Well, I would say to that question that I have asked to myself and I'm now attacking, I don't think it's a very good question. Mostly you can make some statement about why the war was fought, but it was fought for so many different reasons, for so many different people, that's not really the question we should be asking. I guess the question we should be asking is, why were these kinds of wars, why were they allowed to take place? And that's because these European powers were gaining wealth, were gaining position and authority, and were gaining the ability to really badly interfere with each other and interfere with the lives of the people living within their borders, which they did on a mass scale. The state is only getting stronger throughout this period, and we will see in future talks how that culminates. So, does anyone have any questions at all? You can pose them either through voice or on the YouTube channel. I'm monitoring the chat. If you ask questions on that, I'll see them and I can answer them. Or you can say through the chat of the Zoom call itself. If anyone has any questions at all, now is the time to ask them.
Lucas,
yes,
this is John here.
Hi.
To what extent was England involved in this?
So that's a very good question, because you might think, well, England was at this time kind of a Protestant nation. Well, where was the whole Protestant Brotherhood helping out? Well, England was experiencing its own difficulties right now. In fact, in 1648, at the conclusion of the 30 Years' War, the English monarchy was overthrown. There was a civil war. Parliament became sovereign. They eventually chopped the head of the king off. There was a lot of other stuff going on in Britain at this point. The Wars of the Three Kingdoms. There was a whole other crisis, and England was castigated for not helping out the Protestant nations when they were desperately struggling to survive against the Habsburgs. But they had their own issues, I think it's fair to say. So they were suffering from internal strife. I think there were, not English, but from the British Isles, a lot of Irish mercenaries fought on both sides in this war. So in that sense, they were involved. But really, the Three Kingdoms and the British Isles, they were busy, I think it's fair to say.
Okay.
Does anyone else have any questions at all? There's no... I don't, if anyone has something they'd like to know, but they're worried they'll look stupid or something, I want to firmly say, no, that's not a possibility. Every question is good.
Lucas, did I miss what happened to the emperor at the end of all that?
Yes. Well, the emperor remained the emperor. That's the actual position. He was basically just told, you can't keep doing this. You can't squash revolts. You've got to let your Protestant subjects be Protestant, effectively. And in fact, in a big violation of the imperial sovereignty, France and Sweden were given authority to intercede in imperial disputes and mediate them, when that had always been the job of the emperor before. So the emperor still existed. They didn't cut the head off the emperor or anything. He still came to the table in Westphalia and still negotiated and lost some power. But certainly the important thing is lost some power. So stayed the position. The Holy Roman Empire didn't split apart or anything. It wasn't a very definitive peace. Just in terms of the restructuring and rebalancing, the emperor lost a lot of authority. Yeah.
Lucas, we had a bit of a groceries delivery in that bit, so I may have missed something, but do we have an idea of how many people died in this war compared
Yes.
to?
In estimates that we have, the number of casualties is given to 8 million people.
Okay.
Which is huge. In the First World War, the number of military and civilian casualties was around 40 million, which is a lot more, but the population of Europe was a lot less in this time than in 200 years. So as a proportion of the general European population, it's one of the highest casualty rates of all time. And that's partly because there were these big battles and cities were being sacked and destroyed, but also because it lasted for such a long time that the economies of the region were just devastated. And people, there was diseases and famines and all this kind of stuff because there was so much disruption to Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was absolutely devastating. Yeah.
Okay.
I have a question, which is, did the witch hunt cause an imbalance in gender of the population? And as I said before, there's no kind of sense, even estimations are so vague as to how many women were killed in the course of the witch hunts. At least thousands, probably more than that. And it's a terrible case of mass violence. But it's worth mentioning that while that witch hunt's going on, there are massive armies that are almost exclusively made up of men who are smashing into each other and killing each other by the thousands. So while there was no sense of, there weren't really censuses, in fact, of the ratio of populations until the Prussians in the 18th century, so about 100 years off actual censuses. But people are just dying in such massive numbers of men and women that there's no sense that there was an imbalance of gender. But certainly there's an imbalance of political power and social power that was caused by, so not maybe in terms of raw numbers, but in terms of, for example, the position of the wise women of the village, as I said before, that would be a position of quite a lot of authority, not in hard power. They couldn't decide what someone else did with their taxes or something, but the person who has the knowledge to deliver children, to cure people when they are sick, to provide advice, that kind of soft power was taken away over this period. There's a sense that civil rights means that women have slowly gotten more and more, the situation's gotten better over time, but in this case it actually got worse. And so there was an imbalance, not in sheer numbers, but there was an imbalance caused by the witch hunt in this case. Yeah. And often targets the witch hunt would be just particularly outspoken women would be accused and then killed.
Oh dear, I'm glad I wasn't around then.
Exactly. Yeah, me too. In a number of reasons. Are there any other questions at all? Anyone on the YouTube, watching on YouTube? I can see there are 4 viewers. If you have any questions about the 30 Years' War, then go ahead and ask them. It's really a proxy for the whole first half of the 17th century in general, because it almost was all of it, but the different changes and trends and events that were happening in this time. If there are no more questions, this is the last chance before I start saying thank you to everyone. And if not, then yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for coming along. I know there's been a variety of technical difficulties and things going wrong, but well done to everyone for making it to watch. And honestly, yeah, I'm now launching on YouTube now, and if possible, I'd like to start transitioning more towards being on YouTube, because it's so much more convenient that you can just subscribe to the YouTube channel and then you get a notification that appears, and then I'm live and you can just watch it through that, and you don't have to worry about being emailed Zoom links and stuff. And I'll still do the emails because I still want to advertise it. But the fact that every single time I send a Zoom link, it ends up in the spam folder just makes things confusing and frustrating. So yeah, you can find me on YouTube at Mostly Harmless History, and I'll still do it on Zoom, so you don't need to worry about losing service or anything. I would just like to encourage as much as possible that people watch on YouTube, because it just seems easier and it's easier to interact, and it's easier in terms of privacy. If you're worried about your name, it's not, don't worry, but it's more anonymous and all that kind of stuff appears. But thank you very much, everyone, for tagging along. I hope you enjoyed this one. I think next time we're going to talk about, I want to do it, it's going to be a slight segue. We're talking about gender and sexuality in the 18th century, because I did a module on it in second year and I want to talk about it, and it's really interesting. And it's going to be really hardcore social history. And I hope you're ready for it. We're going to talk about gay people and transgender issues and stuff in the 18th century. It's really fascinating stuff. And we're slightly diverging again from Romantic Europe, Germanic Europe stuff, but I think it's worth it because it's so interesting. So thank you all for coming along.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lucas. Very good. Thank you.
And I'll see you all in 2 weeks. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.